For over a decade, an unimaginable crime unfolded in plain sight. Between 1997 and 2013, more than 1,400 children in Rotherham, England were groomed, abused, and exploited, while authorities turned a blind eye. This is not just the story of a scandal. It's the story of betrayal at the highest levels, where silence allowed predators to thrive, and children's voices were ignored. In the late 1990s, the town of Rotherham in South Yorkshire looked ordinary. A quiet community, schools filled with children, and families living their daily routines. But beneath the surface, something far darker was unfolding, a secret that would stay buried for years. Girls as young as 11 were being approached by groups of older men. At first, it looked harmless. A ride in a nice car, a free takeaway meal, cigarettes or vodka slipped into their hands. For children coming from difficult homes, it felt like attention, even care. But these gifts were never free. They were bait. Soon the kindness turned into control. These children were taken to houses or flats where the real horror began. Alcohol and drugs dulled their resistance, and what followed were repeated assaults by men much older than them. Once caught in the cycle, the girls were treated like objects, passed from one abuser to another, sometimes in a single night. It didn't end there. Some were trafficked outside of Rotherham, moved between cities across northern England. They were deliberately isolated, told that no one would believe them if they spoke out. Threats were made against their families. Their lives became a prison of fear. Parents noticed the changes. Their daughters went missing for hours, sometimes days. They begged for help. They reported names, car descriptions, and locations to the police. But instead of being treated as victims, many girls were dismissed as troublesome or promiscuous. Families were told that their children were choosing a lifestyle or simply rebelling. The reality was brutal. These were children, manipulated, trapped, and silenced. They weren't choosing this. They were being groomed, exploited, and discarded. And every time a report was ignored, the perpetrators grew bolder. For years, the abuse continued in plain sight. Teachers suspected. Social workers had concerns. Even police officers heard whispers. But still, nothing changed. And so the cycle repeated, night after night, year after year, while hundreds of children in Rotherham were left defenseless, unheard, and forgotten. By the early 2000s, not everyone in Rotherham was blind to what was happening. A few people saw the patterns and tried to raise the alarm. In 2002, a youth worker began documenting cases of girls being picked up outside schools, given alcohol, and abused by groups of men. She wrote detailed reports, naming locations, suspects, even describing how young the victims were. She expected her findings to spark urgent action. Instead, her warnings were quietly pushed aside. In 2006, another researcher within Rotherham Council gathered overwhelming evidence that hundreds of children were being exploited. She submitted her report, hoping to force change. But instead of protecting the children, senior officials silenced her. Her findings were literally locked away in a drawer, dismissed as too sensitive, too politically risky. The victims themselves tried to speak out. Some went to the police. Others confided in social workers. But instead of being treated as victims, they were often blamed for their own abuse. Many were told they were making poor choices, that they were acting out, that they had brought the trouble on themselves. Imagine being 13 years old, begging for help, and being told you were the problem. The police response was not only inadequate, in some cases, it was shocking. Girls who had been raped and drugged were arrested for drunkenness or for causing disturbances in public. Meanwhile, the men who had abused them walked away freely, confident that no one would stop them. Behind this failure was fear. Local authorities admitted years later that they were afraid to take action because many of the perpetrators were from minority communities. They worried that investigating the crimes would lead to accusations of racism. That fear allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. The few professionals who tried to do the right thing found themselves isolated. Careers were threatened, voices silenced, reputations smeared. The message was clear: stop digging, stop talking, and let it go. But the truth wasn't going away. The reports were piling up. The evidence was there, and the number of victims was growing every single year. By the end of the 2000s, the scandal was no longer just about individual abusers. It was about a system that chose silence over justice, image over children, and denial over truth. By the late 2000s, the silence around Rotherham was starting to crack. Survivors who had been ignored for years began speaking out more forcefully. Some went to journalists, desperate for anyone, to listen. Slowly, investigative reporters started piecing the puzzle together. They found patterns that stretched across neighborhoods. Children going missing for days, coming back withdrawn and broken, only to vanish again. Families told the same stories over and over. Young girls groomed with gifts, threatened into compliance, then passed between groups of men like objects. One survivor, still just a teenager, described being taken to different cities and handed over to strangers. Another recalled being doused with petrol and told her family would be burned alive if she spoke out. These were not isolated cases. They were part of a network of abuse that had been operating openly for years. The authorities could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. Reports were mounting, survivors were naming names, and journalists were exposing case after case in the press. But even then, the reaction from officials was hesitant. Some within the council and the police still insisted the issue was exaggerated, still claimed it was too politically sensitive to confront. By now, however, the numbers were undeniable. This was not a handful of victims. It was hundreds. And by the early 2010s, the figure would rise to more than 1,400 children whose lives had been shattered. The sheer scale of the abuse made denial impossible. The victims were no longer faceless statistics. They were children with names, with families, with stories of unimaginable pain. And with the press shining a spotlight on Rotherham, the entire nation was beginning to ask the question, how could this have gone on for so long, in plain sight, without anyone being held accountable? The breaking point had arrived. The silence was over. And the truth, long buried, was about to explode into the public eye. In 2013, the silence finally shattered. The Times of London published a devastating investigation, exposing how widespread the abuse in Rotherham had become. The public was horrified. What had been whispered about for years was suddenly undeniable. Thousands of children had been systematically groomed and abused while those in power turned away. The pressure was impossible to ignore. In 2014, an independent inquiry led by Professor Alexis J. was launched. Her report shook the country. The findings were brutal. At least 1,400 children had been exploited between 1997 and 2013. Girls had been raped, trafficked, beaten, and threatened with death, and those who should have protected them had not only failed, but actively dismissed their cries for help. The report described police indifference, council negligence, and a culture of fear that stopped people from speaking out. Some officials admitted they were more worried about being labeled racist than about protecting children. Others simply didn't want to disrupt the image of the community. Either way, the result was the same: years of unchecked abuse. The fallout was swift. Senior council members resigned. The police force came under national scrutiny. A handful of abusers were eventually convicted and jailed. But for many survivors, justice came too late, or never came at all. The damage had already been done. The scandal left scars not just on the victims, but on the entire nation. It forced Britain to confront questions about institutional cowardice, about prejudice, and about how many other towns might be hiding the same dark secrets. For the survivors, the inquiry was a bittersweet moment. At last, someone had listened. At last, their stories were believed. But no report, no resignation, and no prison sentence could undo the years of betrayal. The Rotherham scandal remains one of the most shocking child abuse cases in British history. It is a warning of what happens when fear outweighs duty, when silence is chosen over truth, and when children are left to fight for themselves in a world that refused to protect them. The Rotherham scandal wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal. Over 1,400 children, failed by the very people sworn to protect them. Their stories remind us that silence is never neutral. Silence is deadly. If this story shocked you, don't let it be forgotten. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe with the bell on, so you never miss our next true crime investigation.